Now, sometimes people want to go off the beaten path. They're like, hey, you know what? I can't do velocity. I use your zones or anything because I don't use those exercises. That's okay. Here's what to do when you've gone off the beaten path for that. Why do some people not pick those exercises, the typical ones? Well, we also have to stop and realize for a second that every coach has got a cognitive bias, whether they realize it or not. Most strength and conditioning coaches are in the field because they like lifting weights, and many athletes consequently do not like to lift weights. So we have to realize that we're probably going to slide more towards what our background is. Most strength and conditioning coaches have either got an Olympic lifting or powerlifting background, and that's what keeps them motivated and that's what keeps them going in training. I'm here to tell you right now that that's not always the best thing in the world to do, because if you train the way that you would for a competition, you are going to get really good at the competition exercises. A lot of times, those exercises will cease to transfer to the sport, like we talked about with these squats. You've got to figure out what else needs to be done. And because you're figuring out a different exercise, you may, in fact, have to go create your own zones. So, and also, with those different exercises, we've got to figure out how to do things. Well, the first step is to make sure that the technique is perfect in that exercise. You don't want to be looking at a load velocity profile of something that is not perfect. They need to be good. They need to be automatic on the movement. You want to measure the velocity with the perfect technique for that movement. Then you're going to create the velocity load profile, and you'll start light and increase load. You can go all the way up to 1 RM, or you can simply find where power begins to decrease and then stop, and then utilize the velocity at which peak power occurred as a reference point. Now, we could back off by about a quarter meter per second, and that's going to be speed strength. And we could, add a quarter meter per second on, and that's speed strength, or we could take a quarter meter per second off, and that would be the strength speed zones. And that's usually about that 15 or 20% is that 0.25 meters per second. So you could perform that. And then if you start and you find the means to the percentage of 1 RMs for your team, and you find that there's a small standard deviation, you can utilize zones of your own. That's how we started the zones that I've created. So if you're not using a linear position transducer, maybe you have an accelerometer, maybe you have a camera-based system that you like, do exactly the same thing. Okay? Do exactly the same thing. Do the load velocity profile. Now, the strengths of VBT is that we've got an exactness of work. Is it speed strength? Is it absolute strength? It doesn't matter. We know exactly what we're training. Then also it's the instant feedback, which just enhances the efficacy of your training. And then it also nurtures the competitive nature. Now, some issues to account for. One of the areas that I've noticed is height. Now, for a lot of athletes, it doesn't matter. Whenever we're looking at an exercise like a squat, a taller athlete tends to widen their stance out, so they are adding to the frontal plane to take away from the sagittal plane, essentially. And then that means that the distance, the range of motion that they're traveling through is not much different. Up until a point. If somebody's squatting inside a rack and they're over about 6'6", 6'7", you can only put your feet out so wide because the rack is there. Then you have to increase the velocity because you cannot widen out any further. Technical proficiency. I've seen a lot of athletes who have very, very poor technique and they utilize velocity, and the coach might be telling them how great they're doing because the speed was high, but the technique was absolute crap. So you must always coach the form, and form has got to be before weight and speed. And also work ethic. Work ethic is definitely an area that you have to account for. If somebody does not want to work hard, they know that if they just move the bar slower, that they can get out of having to do heavy lifting. Now, one of the ways that I've worked around that is by making velocity something that you had to earn, and not everybody got to utilize it. They had to earn the right to VBT. And whenever we took that approach, there was only one individual that we ever had issues with over a course of about 10 years with failing to work hard when utilizing velocity. Here's a list of some of the velocities that we've used over the time whenever we were at the University of Missouri and for some different movements.